Our eyes are yet to open. Grant us eyes, grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy.
In their quest to understand the Great Ones, the major figures and institutions of Bloodborne recognized their shortcomings. They were thinking on the basis of planes and realized that they needed more advanced knowledge, or eyes on the inside. As their titles would imply, the scholars of Byrgenwerth, the doctors of the Healing Church, the students of the School of Mensis, and the scholars of the choir dedicated themselves to research and the advancement of knowledge, perhaps best documented by the description of an eye cord. Provost Willem sought the cord in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a Great One, by lining his brain with eyes, the only choice, he knew, if man were to ever match their greatness. Although we're led to believe that the Great Ones are enigmatic cosmic beings from a higher plane, we saw in the first installment of this two-part episode that the Great Ones share an unusual trait. They all appear to be designed as things found within the human body. In this concluding portion of the episode, we'll see how the Great Ones serve as the keystone of the medical metaphor that buttresses the story of Bloodborne. Today, we plunge our hands into the viscera of the Great Ones and extract a hidden meaning of the game. This video will require a bit of patience, focus, and a willingness to engage in abstraction. The journey admittedly will be daunting at times, but the destination should make it worthwhile. We'll try to accomplish three main tasks along the way. First, we'll very quickly recap the top-line takeaways of this series so far pertaining to the Victorian medical metaphor. If you're new to the series and you feel a little lost or maybe unconvinced about this video's line of analysis, you might want to check out the other videos for more detailed explanations. Second, we'll take a closer look at the concept of insight and how it works as both a game mechanic and a narrative mechanic. It's critical to our understanding of the Great Ones and the game's hidden narrative. I'll also reveal the real-life inspiration for the mensis cage, and how this item helps us explain the true meaning of the Great Ones. That will segue nicely into the third section, in which we'll answer the lingering question: why are the Great Ones designed as things found within the human body? In this section, we'll see how Ebrietas and the Great Eyes Chalice draw from real-life medical history in what I think is a mind-blowing revelation. I had hoped to use this video to circle back to some of the bosses that I deemed in the previous video were either inconclusive or don't appear to be Great Ones, but the video was going to end up being way too long, so instead I'll just split that off into a separate video which I'll release next week. A courtesy warning: this video will contain images of partially dissected bodies. Also, all references I make to the Japanese text are credited to Last Protagonist, whose channel and translations database are linked in the description. With that, let's get started with a brief but essential recap. Throughout this series, we've seen how From Software used real-life Victorian medicine as a skeletal framework upon which the game's narrative flesh is attached. For example, in Episode 2, I showed how the healing blood is a metaphor for ether, the first successful surgical anesthetic. In Episode 11, on Canehurst, we saw how the vial blood is a parallel for chloroform, a competing anesthetic to ether that rose to popularity thanks to its use in pain-free childbirth. In Episode 4, we examined the similarities between the College of Byrgenwerth and the University of Edinburgh Medical School in the late 1700s, with their architectural similarities, their shared focus on the central nervous system, and their use of botanics and botanical gardens to study pharmaceuticals. In Episode 5, we saw how the School of Mensis serves as an analog for the prolific anatomists of Edinburgh in the early 1800s, the surgeons and medical students who carved up dead bodies for anatomical research. And in Episode 6, we made important aesthetic comparisons between the Healing Church and the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, while also showing how the evolution of the church attire mirrors the evolution of real-life medical attire during the 1800s. Although we went into much greater depth in various episodes, these represent many of the top-line takeaways of the series so far when it comes to the medical metaphor. While these medical references might initially seem irrelevant to our understanding of the Great Ones, this context is invaluable for our comprehension of insight, which serves as a sort of bridge between the medical metaphor and the Great Ones. As I noted earlier, we learned from a variety of items and bits of cinematic dialogue that the institutions of Bloodborne, meaning the College of Byrgenwerth, the Healing Church, the School of Mensis, and the choir, have a common desire or goal. They all want to gain insight. It's not entirely clear what insight means. We get a bit of mixed messaging. But if nothing else, we're led to assume it means advanced knowledge or an epiphany that results from coming into contact with something that's outside of our empirical understanding. The game's main institutions, in their own unique way, are striving to gain insight because they believe it's required so that humanity can evolve or advance, as evidenced by the 1/3 umbilical cord description that we examined earlier, which details Provost Willem's desire to elevate his thoughts to match the greatness of the Great Ones. Within the game, we gain insight primarily in two ways: the discovery of new places and bosses, and through the use of items. But it's not just any items. They're items that are designed and labeled as body parts. These include Madman's Knowledge, Great One's Wisdom, and the 1/3 of umbilical cords. An umbilical cord, of course, would be found within the body. But with the Madman's Knowledge and the Great One's Wisdom, the artwork indicates to us that the insight we gain from these items is coming from within the skull of a dead body. Why would that be the case, and why is that relevant? For hundreds of years, mainly the 1600s to the 1800s, medical knowledge was gained primarily by dissecting dead bodies, or cadavers. As we discussed in episode 5, the School of Mensis and Yahar'gul almost certainly are dramatized depictions of this form of medical research, which became the calling card of Edinburgh, Scotland's medical community in the early 1800s. Mensis, and to some extent Byrgenwerth, with their student uniforms, lecture theatres, and laboratories, are meant to depict the Victorian medical schools of Great Britain. On behalf of the School of Mensis, the kidnapper enemies kill people and transport their bodies to Yahar'gul, much like the real-life Burkers and body snatchers of the Victorian era would either kill people and sell their bodies to medical schools and surgeons, or would dig up corpses from fresh graves and sell them to anatomists. Anatomical dissection appears to be an important element within the game's underlying metaphor. In addition to the allusions to anatomical dissection that we see with Mensis and Yahar'gul, we also saw in the first episode of the series that game director Hidetaka Miyazaki made a major reference to dissection during a 2015 interview with Future Press. When asked about the term pale blood, Miyazaki said it was meant as a comparison to the night sky of Yahar'gul after we kill Ram. The sky there is a very pale blue, Miyazaki said, like a body drained of blood. A body drained of blood in real life is a cadaver, and Miyazaki's specific reference to Yahar'gul, a realm overseen by the School of Mensis, which depicts the dissection of bodies for medical study, is all meant to help us see the relevance of anatomical dissection to the game's underlying meaning. It's also why this is one of the most well-recognized lines of dialogue in the entire game.
A corpse should be left well alone.
We'll return to this concept repeatedly in this video and the final episode of the series. As we've also seen again and again in this series, From Software used hunters as a metaphor for surgeons and anatomists, while also treating beasts as a metaphor for surgical patients and, more commonly, cadavers. With all of that critical context in mind, let's take a closer look at the concept of insight, starting with the items that grant us insight. With both the Madman's Knowledge and the Great One's Wisdom, we can see a skull that's been split open. If we just take the artwork casually or without any serious thought, we might just think, oh, it's a spooky skull that was shattered by this powerful cosmic knowledge, this eldritch truth that literally blew this person's mind wide open. But if we view it with the medical metaphor in mind, the artwork and descriptions for these items have a much more profound meaning. Knowing that Bloodborne is so deeply rooted in surgery and dissection, the skulls we see in the artwork for these items are supposed to depict a human skull that has been broken apart by an anatomist who's studying the brain of a dead man. There's a ton of evidence to support this notion. We'll build our way into the most compelling clues. One element of the madman's knowledge artwork helps us make this cadaver connection. It's the fangs. Even though blood drinking is a huge part of the game, Bloodborne doesn't have vampires. The fangs are a reference to a beast. As I just said, Bloodborne treats beasts as a metaphor for cadavers and surgical patients, and the skull contains the sharp teeth of a beast, indicating that this skull belongs to a cadaver that has been dissected. The insight that the player character gains in the game from consuming a madman's knowledge is just like the medical insight an anatomist would gain from breaking open a skull and examining the brain. With this in mind, we can now turn to the item description. There are two huge takeaways of the item description, especially if we examine the original Japanese text. The description in English states, "Skull of a madman touched by the wisdom of the great ones, used to gain insight. Making contact with eldritch wisdom is a blessing, for even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose for posterity." In Japanese, the latter portion of the item description is much more revealing. It says, even if they go mad, it is good fortune for those who come into contact with arcane wisdom, especially since it will become aid for future generations. The description is telling us that the knowledge gained from whatever is inside this dead man's skull will aid future generations, just like the medical knowledge gained from cutting open a dead body and examining it will save lives in future generations. If you're skeptical, I get it, but check this out. Although insight is the term used in the English version of the game, the term that From Software used in the original Japanese was keimo, which means enlightenment or instruction. Last Protagonist suggested that keimo is better translated as having knowledge of something and passing it on or teaching it to others. This could not be a more appropriate conclusion on his part based upon what we now understand. We can conclude from the Japanese text that by using the madman's knowledge, we gain enlightenment or material for instruction that can be taught to others and thereby aid future generations. This undoubtedly is an allusion to the medical knowledge gained from dissecting corpses in an effort to teach and train doctors who can then save future generations from illness and disease. The term eyes on the inside now seems more appropriate than ever. It refers to a surgeon's or anatomist's ability to literally see within the human body during surgery or dissection. Their view of the internal organs of the body is what it means to have eyes on the inside. Within Bloodborne, Willem wants to line his brain with eyes to somehow better comprehend the Great Ones. This makes sense mechanically speaking because insight allows the player character to see the world as it truly is. In fact, one of the best illustrations of this mechanic is within Cathedral Ward. Once we obtain 40 insight, we're able to see the massive amygdala clinging to the side of Uden Chapel. In this regard, only by having enough insight or eyes on the inside can we see certain Great Ones. But as we gain insight, we ironically begin to see eyeballs on things in the game, from the lanterns of the church servants to the faces of the man-eater boars. In a sense, as we gain insight, we start putting eyeballs on the details of the Bloodborne world. Although Micolash and Willem want to quite literally line their brains with eyes, which explains the jars filled with eyeballs within Byrgenwerth and the laboratories of the lecture building, this is just a literary and design choice by From Software to emphasize the horror elements of the game while keeping the subtext directly underfoot. Just like eyes on the inside, the concept of brains lined with eyes should be interpreted to mean a surgeon's or anatomist's eyes being able to literally view the brain, and thus the insight gained from the anatomical examination elevates their medical knowledge to a higher plane. If you're still skeptical and yet somehow still watching, this might help. Let's look at another insight-granting item, the Great One's wisdom, and we'll connect it with several other elements of the game. The description states, fragments of the lost wisdom of the Great Ones, beings that might be described as gods. The description of Great Ones as gods is important. Gehrman refers to the labyrinth, or what players often refer to colloquially as the chalice dungeons, as the tomb of the gods that can be unlocked with a holy chalice. Alfred similarly tells us that the labyrinth carved out beneath Yharnam is known as the Tomb of the Gods. This seems to suggest that the Great Ones by and large are dead and essentially buried in the ground. Referring to the labyrinth as a tomb of the gods is appropriate and enlightening in terms of our medical metaphor and how it relates to the College of Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church. As I noted in episode 4, the word Bergen is an Old English word meaning burial place or grave. We can thus view the College of Byrgenwerth as the College of the Grave. Byrgenwerth by name, therefore, is associated with tombs, graves, or burial places. We see this linkage of Byrgenwerth and graves in even greater detail in the item description of the Tomb Prospector set, which in Japanese reads, "Attire in the Healing Church, particularly for diving into and grave robbing the underground ruins." Byrgenwerth is the origin of the Healing Church, therefore they know just what the ruins are. They are not merely a hideaway of trinkets that strengthen hunters. They are a path of research. The metaphor is punching us in the face. Byrgenwerth's research was rooted in the exploration of graves, but they didn't care about the hunter trinkets. They brought back something else from the grave, the remnants or knowledge of the Great Ones. This is just like the Victorian surgeons and anatomists who paid men to take bodies from fresh graves so that they could dissect and study them for medical research. The tombs are a path of research. With all of this in mind, we can now easily answer the question, why are the Great Ones designed as things found within the human body? It's because they're meant to represent the organs, systems, and yes, even the fetuses that surgeons and anatomists would have discovered and studied during the course of surgical operations and much more commonly during dissections of the Victorian era. Just like the Great Ones, these internal features of the body would have only been observable with eyes on the inside of the human body, and only through intense study could these features grant insight, meaning medical knowledge that could be taught to others to aid future generations. Let's now take a look at a couple of the creatures that the game's text confirms are Great Ones, and that we confirmed in the last video are designed as things found within the body, and see how they fit into this medical framework. As I said in the previous video, the brain of mensis is the most important creature for our understanding of the Great Ones. That's because the brain of mensis looks like a brain, is called a brain, and is described by an item as a brain. The brain's name also immediately connects it with the school of mensis. We find the brain in the Nightmare of Mensis, where we encounter Mikolash, the host of the nightmare, who is wearing the student uniform associated with the school of mensis. The brain drops the living string, which indicates that the students of the school of mensis somehow made contact with the brain of mensis, which is described as a great one, but specifically as a rotten brain. This implies the brain was decomposed. In Japanese, the term used to describe the brain is eroded. The implication is clear. The brain of mensis represents a decomposed, rotted, or eroded brain of a corpse. The students of the school of mensis, wearing the gowns of Victorian medical students, are being portrayed as figures who dissected a dead body and encountered this decomposed brain. They could have only encountered this brain by having literal eyes on the inside, meaning a view inside the human body. We learn from the item commonly called Murgo's cord, the umbilical cord obtained after defeating Murgo's Wetners, that this cord granted mensis audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. The use of the term stillbirth seems to suggest that the brain of mensis wasn't just any brain that the mensis scholars found. It was the brain of an unborn child. We'll discuss this idea in greater depth in the final episode. We're told that the mensis scholars used their iconic mensis cage headwear to make contact with the Great Ones. This item provides us with one of the most resounding pieces of evidence to support the medical metaphor. The mensis cage appears to be inspired by what's known as a birdcage radiofrequency coil, or RF coil, a device used in MRIs for brain scans. In addition to their similar appearance and the use of the word cage in their names, the function of the birdcage RF coil and the mensis cage are extremely similar as well. As detailed in the medical textbook Magnetic Resonance Imaging of the Body, the RF coils are basically radio antennas that are used to transmit and receive radio waves. The performance of the imager is critically dependent on how efficiently the antenna transfers energy to and from the body. In essence, the RF coil acts as an antenna to amplify the radio signal coming out of the body and allows a computer to digitally display the signal, allowing doctors to gain eyes on the inside. They can see what's happening in the brain via the MRI scan. Now, let's look at the description of the mensis cage. The cage is a device that restrains the will of the self, allowing one to see the profane world for what it is. It also serves as an antenna that facilitates contact with the Great Ones of the dream. Just like the birdcage RF coil allows medical experts to make contact with the human brain, the mensis cage allowed the mensis scholars to make contact with the brain of mensis, a great one and thing found within the human body. Although the RF coil is modern and clashes with the Victorian portion of our Victorian medical metaphor, it firmly supports the overall medical metaphor without question. I suggested in the last video that Ebrietas is designed as a monstrous version of the trachea. Her face is the opening of the throat, and the sides of her head are similar to the lobes of the butterfly-shaped thyroid gland, which is where Ebrietas derives her name, as it's a genus of butterfly. I'm sure plenty of people think my argument is ridiculous, but I'm going to present a second batch of evidence that I think makes it exceptionally difficult to reject this idea. There's something unique about Ebrietas. Unlike the other confirmed Great Ones that we encounter, Ebrietas is found within the waking world. She's in the cavern beneath the Grand Cathedral, the architectural centerpiece of the Healing Church, an organization dedicated to its ether-like healing blood. Ebrietas' presence here is unusual considering the other Great Ones are found within the dream or nightmare realms. The moon presence is in the hunter's dream. Kaz and the orphan are found in the hunter's nightmare. Murgo and Murgo's wet nurse, assuming they are Great Ones, are found in the nightmare of mensis. And the amygdala is found in the nightmare frontier. And even though there's a ton of speculation that Udden was responsible for impregnating Ariana and therefore must exist at least occasionally within the waking world, there's really no hard evidence of that. We have to go out on a limb a little bit to suggest it. But as far as Ebrietas is concerned, it is unique that she's found in the waking world. The mensis cage and the moon rune tell us plainly that the Great Ones inhabit or exist within the dream. Because that's the case, it makes sense that Ebrietas is referred to as abandoned Ebrietas, or the left-behind Great One. She's supposed to exist in the nightmare or dream realm, but she's seemingly stuck here in Yharnam. Why does any of that matter? To answer that question, we have to turn our attention to several important items. As we learn from the Great Eyes Chalice, the choir found the chalice within the labyrinth and brought it back to the surface, which allowed them to have audience with Ebrietas. I believe these are elegant visual and verbal clues to help bolster the medical metaphor. Let me explain. Take a look at the eyes chalice. It doesn't look like any of the other chalices we use to access lands within the labyrinth. It's not a traditional goblet or cup like the other chalices. It looks organic, not man-made. I believe the eyes chalice was designed to resemble a rotten tooth, specifically a molar. The first medical procedure in which general anesthesia was employed took place in 1846, when American dentist and chemist William T.G. Morton first used ether to successfully and painlessly extract a patient's rotted tooth, bringing it back to the surface, so to speak. The successful use of ether as a general anesthetic, essentially knocking the patient unconscious during the dental procedure, paved the way for ether to become the world's first successful surgical anesthetic, and led to the development of other anesthetics and techniques that allowed physicians for the first time to observe internal organs and systems while the patient was still alive. Nearly 50 years after Morton's seminal tooth removal, physicians used cocaine as an anesthetic along with a device known as an otoscope, allowing them to directly view the larynx for the first time in a living body. The larynx is known as the voice box. It contains the vocal cords. This is why Ebrietas is designed as a gigantic trachea, with her head shown as the opening of the throat or larynx, which contains the vocal cords. She represents one of the first internal systems that physicians were ever able to observe in a living patient, thanks to the use of anesthesia. Moreover, the organization within Bloodborne that made contact and is closely associated with Ebrietas is the choir. Just like real-life physicians laid eyes on the vocal cords thanks to anesthesia, the choir was granted audience with the Great One known as Ebrietas, which is a cosmic horror depiction of a trachea home to the voice box. And while I can't say for certain, this might be what the moon rune is supposed to depict, the view of the larynx. The rune description states, "The great ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called upon." But in Japanese, it's even clearer, stating, "There are many cases of the great ones responding to the voices of those calling out." The moon rune, when turned 90 degrees, appears to depict the vocal cords as seen within the body using a laryngoscope. This would naturally be the source of a voice that's calling out. We've seen other examples in which the Carol runes represent concepts or features of medicine or medical science. The clawmark rune depicts a surgical incision that's been stitched up. The hunter rune, when turned upside down, matches the incision pattern used during dissections and autopsies. And as I posted on the Bloodborne subreddit a couple of months ago, the air rune is a crude depiction of the double helix of DNA, which makes sense given the item description. Perhaps the air is a hunter bearing the echoing wills of those before him. Shout out to Reddit user Am I Not Monstrous, who smartly pointed out in response to my post that the artwork for the air rune even displays the alternating major and minor grooves of the DNA strand. The moon rune depicting the larynx certainly seems plausible. There's more to the idea that Ebrietas represents the trachea and vocal cords seen for the first time in a living patient. We know with virtual certainty that Mikolash's physical body is dead in the waking world and presumably has been that way for a long time, but his consciousness persists in the nightmare of mensis, a transcendental realm that, because he's dead, serves in a sense as an afterlife. We're also led to believe that the same can be said for Gehrman, Maria, Lawrence, and Ludwig, figures who have been dead in the waking world for many, many years, but whose consciousness somehow persists in these dream realms that by default are their afterworlds. I'm certainly aware of the commonly held belief that the Great Ones are transcendental beings that can move between dimensions or planes of existence. But I've wondered if there's another way to interpret this. If the dream worlds essentially act as a purgatory, hell, or some other underworld for the human figures of the game, might it be similar for the Great Ones? After all, the Great Ones are referred to as gods throughout the game, and yet the only place we know they've existed other than the dream worlds is in the Tomb of the Gods, implying they're somehow dead. Although I don't really know how to pronounce it, the Thumeru Ihil or Ihil chalice description in Japanese seems to suggest they're not just asleep or slumbering. They're divine creatures that have gone on to the next life. If this is true, then Ebrietas being a living Great One within the waking world helps support my previous assertion that Ebrietas' design as the trachea was inspired by doctors' first direct view of the vocal cords within a living patient in the 1800s. It also seems to suggest one possibility. The Great Ones that we find in the dream realms, just like the human figures, are all dead. They might be more like spirits who represent organs and other things that were found in the human body during dissection of a corpse. The presence of the lesser amygdalae in the waking world certainly undercuts this idea, so this particular theory might be misguided. I think it's interesting and plausible nonetheless, and maybe you can shed more light on it than I can. In the next video, we'll turn our attention to the group of creatures that I said in the previous video were either inconclusive, not likely to be Great Ones, or are Great Ones but can't be subjected to our visual test. Afterward, in the final part of this series, we'll stitch everything together in a summarized explanation of Bloodborne's underlying story.